My brother called me a greedy, selfish little sister in front of our entire family at Thanksgiving dinner. He said I had no loyalty, no heart, and that I was hoarding wealth while our parents struggled. He said it loud enough for our aunt, our cousins, our grandmother, everyone to hear. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and opened the folder I'd been building for the past 4 months. By the time dessert was supposed to happen, my brother had gone completely silent. My mother was crying, and my father, the man who'd spent 20 minutes nodding along while my brother tore me apart, was staring at the dining room table like he wanted to disappear into it. I'll back up. My name is Serena. I'm 32 years old. I'm a senior financial analyst at a logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I own a 2-bedroom condo that I bought myself at 29. I have no credit card debt, and I've been maxing out my 401k since I was 24 because I watched my parents fight about money my entire childhood, and I promised myself I would never live like that. My brother's name is Marcus. He's 36. He's always been the golden child. The firstborn son, the one who played varsity football, the one who got a full ride to state school on an athletic scholarship. My parents never missed a single one of his games. They drove 4 hours round trip for away games. They wore his jersey number on t-shirts. When I graduated summa cum laude from UNC Charlotte, my father took a half day from work and my mother forgot to bring the camera. I don't say that to sound bitter. I'm just telling you the facts so you understand the foundation of what happened. Marcus has always believed that being the oldest, being the son, being the one my parents orbited around, meant that certain things were owed to him, not earned. Owed. He married his college girlfriend, Tara, about 8 years ago. They have 2 kids. They bought a house in the suburbs that was, honestly, a little more house than their combined income could comfortably support. I knew this because Marcus told me himself, back when we still had the kind of relationship where he'd ask my opinion on things. He laughed it off, said they'd grow into it. They didn't grow into it. For the first couple of years after I bought my condo, things between us were fine. Then something shifted. I got a promotion. Then another one. Marcus's company went through a round of layoffs and he was out of work for almost 7 months. Tara was working part-time because their younger kid had some health stuff going on. It was a genuinely hard season for them, and I felt for them. I actually did. I sent money twice without being asked. The first time it was $2,000 just to help cover a car payment they were behind on. The second time it was $1,500 toward a medical bill. I didn't tell anyone I did that. Not my parents, not my friends. It wasn't a loan. I gave it to him because he's my brother and he needed help, and that's what you do. He never said thank you. Not once. He texted me a thumbs up emoji when I sent the second payment. That's fine. I let it go. What I couldn't let go was what started happening about a year and a half ago. Marcus got a new job. Decent one. Project manager at a construction company. Things should have stabilized, but instead his financial behavior seemed to get worse, not better. My mother started calling me more often. Not to talk, really, but to ask questions. Subtle at first. You're doing well at work, right? You have savings, don't you? You know your brother's going through a hard time. I'd answer honestly and then steer the conversation somewhere else, because I could feel where it was going and I didn't want to go there. Then one Sunday in March, my father called me directly. He almost never calls me directly. He told me that Marcus needed to borrow $80,000. I thought I'd misheard him. I actually asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. He explained, calmly, like this was a totally reasonable thing to ask, that Marcus and Tara were significantly underwater on their mortgage, that they'd taken out a home equity line of credit 2 years ago to handle some expenses, and that they were now behind on both. He said the bank was starting the foreclosure process. He said Marcus had been too ashamed to ask me himself. He said the family was asking me to step in. I sat with that for a second. Then I asked my father where he expected me to get $80,000. He said, from your savings. You have it. He wasn't wrong that I had savings, but the way he said it. Like my savings were a family resource that had been temporarily stored in my account. made my stomach turn. I told him I needed time to think about it. He said, "Don't think too long. This is your brother." I spent about 2 weeks genuinely wrestling with it. Not because I thought I should give Marcus $80,000. I knew I wasn't going to do that, but because I was trying to understand the right way to respond to my family asking me to do something that irrational. I talked to 2 people I trust. I ran the numbers. I thought about what giving away a significant chunk of my emergency fund and down payment savings would actually mean for my financial security. And then I started doing something else. I started paying attention. I don't know exactly what made me do it. Some instinct, maybe, or just the fact that I think in spreadsheets. But I started looking more carefully at the financial picture my parents had been describing. My father had mentioned the home equity line. He'd mentioned the home equity line. He'd mentioned the foreclosure. He'd mentioned that they'd handled some expenses. But none of the numbers added up to me. Marcus's house had been purchased for $300,000 in 2017. Based on comparable sales in his area, it was worth somewhere between $380,000 and $410,000 now, even if he was behind on his mortgage, even if he'd maxed a HELOC. That house had equity. So why was foreclosure the only option? Why wasn't the answer to sell the house? I asked my mother this, carefully, and she got flustered and said I didn't understand the whole situation. I started asking more questions. Over the next 6 weeks, I talked to my aunt, my mother's sister, who has always been more honest with me than my parents are. I asked her what she knew. She was hesitant at first, but eventually she told me something that made everything click. 2 years ago, my parents had refinanced their own home. They took out $115,000 in cash equity. My aunt assumed they'd used it to help pay off some of their own debt. They'd always carried a little credit card debt, nothing alarming, just the low-grade financial stress of a middle-class couple who never quite caught up. But the debt was still there. My parents' financial situation hadn't improved after the refinance. If anything, it had gotten a little worse. So where did the $115,000 go? I didn't have a direct answer yet. But I had a direction. I want to be precise here because I know how serious this is and I don't want to overstate anything. I'm not a forensic accountant. I wasn't hacking into anyone's bank accounts. What I did was legal, careful, and slow. My parents had, years ago, added me to one of their older savings accounts, a joint account from when I was in college in case of emergency. The account was mostly dormant, but it was still technically accessible to me online. I logged in for the first time in probably 4 years. The account had $47 in it. That wasn't interesting. What was interesting were the transfer records. Over a period of about 18 months, that account had been used as a pass-through. Money had come in from my parents' primary checking account in chunks. $8,000 here, $12,000 there, and then been transferred out to an account I didn't recognize. I wrote down every transaction I could see. Then I logged out and did not touch that account again. Then I started building a document. I cross-referenced everything I could access legitimately. Property records, which are public. The refinance on my parents' home, which was recorded with the county. I looked at Marcus's mortgage history, which you can pull from the county assessor's office. I found the HELOC. I found when it had been opened. I found the lender. And I found something else. There was a second lien on Marcus's property. Filed 14 months ago. The lien holder was listed as a private individual, not a bank, not a financial institution, a person, with a last name I recognized. My father's last name. My father had taken money from the refinance of his own home and lent it to Marcus privately, secured against Marcus's house. That explained why the money from the refinance hadn't improved my parents' finances. It had gone to Marcus. And it explained why my parents were now in a tight spot. They were carrying the debt from their own refinance while also being owed money by a son whose house was heading toward foreclosure, which meant they might never get repaid. But here's what it didn't explain. Why my parents were asking me for $80,000 instead of acknowledging any of this. I think I knew the answer, but I needed to hear it said out loud. The Thanksgiving plan had been my mother's idea, actually. She called in September and made a big deal about wanting everyone together. The whole family, She wanted to rent a big table at my aunt and uncle's place, invite the cousins, make it a real gathering. I said yes because I love my aunt and uncle, and I hadn't seen my cousins in 2 years. I drove up from Charlotte the Wednesday before. I stayed with my aunt, not with my parents. I told my mother it was just easier, that I was tired from the drive. The real reason was that I needed to not be in that house. Thanksgiving was warm and loud in the way big family gatherings can be. My cousin's kids were running around. My uncle was doing something complicated with a smoker in the backyard. I helped my aunt with the sides and let myself just be a person for a while. Not a financial resource or a plot point in my brother's story. Marcus arrived with Tara and the kids about an hour before dinner. He hugged me at the door. He seemed normal, almost too normal. A little too much eye contact, a little too much laughing at things that weren't that funny. I recognized it as the energy of someone who had been coached. We sat down to dinner. It was good. It was genuinely good for a while. Then my father tapped his fork against his glass. He made a toast. He talked about family and loyalty, and how the measure of a family isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when things are hard. He looked at me when he said that last part. Marcus spoke next. He didn't stand up. He just started talking from his seat. He talked about the tough year they'd had, him and Tara. He talked about how much stress they'd been under. He talked about how much stress they'd been under. He talked about the kids, about wanting to give them stability. He talked about how he'd always been there for this family, always, and he just needed one person to step up the way he'd always stepped up. Then he looked at me and said I had been sitting on money while my family struggled. He said I had more than I'd ever need and I was choosing comfort over family. He said the word hoarding. He said I'd been raised better than this. My aunt's face went very still. My uncle stopped moving. My cousins were looking at the tablecloth. Marcus kept going. He said he'd heard I was considering it, the $80,000, and that he didn't understand what was taking so long. He said I owed him, actually, for being the one who always took the pressure off me growing up, for being the one our parents worried about so I could just quietly do my thing. He said I was benefiting from a system I hadn't built and it was time to contribute. I let him finish. I reached into my bag. My phone was already unlocked. I pulled up the folder. I had a PDF, 12 pages. I'd emailed it to myself that morning and also airdropped it to my tablet, just in case. I set my phone in the center of the table and slid it toward my father. I said, before we talk about what I owe, can we talk about what happened to the money from your refinance? My father looked at the phone. He didn't pick it up. I said, there's a private lien on Marcus's property, filed in your name, for $78,000, secured against the house that's now in foreclosure, which means if that house goes, you lose that money too, and you still owe the bank on your own refinance. The table was completely silent. My mother said my name, just my name, like a warning. I said, I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I'm trying to understand why the solution to the situation is me handing over $80,000 when the actual problem is that $115,000 in equity was pulled out of your house, a significant portion of it went to Marcus's house, and that money is now at risk. That's not something my savings fixes. That's a much bigger conversation. Marcus said, where did you get that information? I said, public records, county assessor's office, completely legal. He said I had no right to go digging around in family business. I said, you called me greedy in front of 20 people. I think that opened the door. My father finally picked up my phone. He looked at the document. His jaw tightened. My mother had started crying quietly. My uncle, and I will love him forever for this, reached over and gently took the phone from my father's hands, looked at it for about 30 seconds, and then set it down and said, I think we need to have a different conversation than the one we planned. What followed was not a dramatic, clean resolution. Real life doesn't work like that. What happened was that the dinner sort of quietly disintegrated. My cousins took the kids outside. My aunt and uncle sat with my parents in the living room for a long time. I stayed at the table and ate a second piece of pie because I hadn't eaten much, and I was shaking a little and I needed something to do with my hands. Tara came and sat across from me about 40 minutes later. She looked exhausted in the way that people do when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She didn't apologize for Marcus. She didn't say much of anything, actually. She just said, "I didn't know it had gone this far." I believe her. I think she meant it. Marcus didn't speak to me for the rest of the evening. He left with the kids around 8. My father came and found me before they left and said in a very quiet voice that he hadn't meant for things to go this way. I said, "I know." I didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say right then. In the weeks after Thanksgiving, things were slow and uncomfortable and not particularly cinematic. My mother and I had a long phone call where she cried, and I listened and I said what I genuinely felt, which was that I loved her, and I was not going to give Marcus $80,000, and I needed her to understand that those two things could both be true at the same time. My father had a conversation with a financial advisor. My uncle pushed him to. It turned out the situation was serious, but not unsurvivable. Marcus and Tara would need to sell the house. They would need to rent something smaller. My father would need to accept that the private loan was likely partially lost. It was painful and humbling and real. Marcus called me in December. I almost didn't pick up. He didn't apologize right away. He talked around it for a few minutes. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said he'd been under more pressure than I knew. I said, "I know you were. And I helped you twice when you were struggling, without telling anyone or asking for anything back. That's what I can do. I can't give you $80,000. It would wipe out half my financial security, and it wouldn't actually fix the underlying problem." Long pause. He said, "I didn't know you helped before. Mom never told me." I said, "I know." Another long pause. He said, "That was wrong. What I said at dinner, in front of everyone." I said, "Yeah." I didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't. But I didn't hang up either. We're not close right now. We're not whatever we were before, which, if I'm honest, wasn't all that much. But we're in contact. He and Tara sold the house in February. They're renting a townhouse about 20 minutes from my parents. The kids are okay. Tara got a full-time position at a medical office and seems steadier. My parents are working through their own finances. It's humbling for them, I know. My father is proud, and this has cost him something. I try to call my mother every week. I try to show up as a daughter, even when I'm still a little angry. And my savings account? Still intact. Still mine. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you're in something similar, people who love you should not need to publicly humiliate you to ask for help. That's not a request. That's pressure. And the moment someone tries to make your financial stability feel like a moral failing, you are allowed to stop and ask what's actually going on. Because 9 times out of 10, the thing they're asking you to fix is not the real problem. The real problem is always older and messier, and not something your bank account can solve. I know that now. I wish I'd known it sooner. But I'm glad I had the receipts. I've thought a lot about that Thanksgiving dinner since it happened. Not with anger anymore. Mostly just with a kind of quiet clarity that took a while to settle in. What Marcus did that night wasn't really about money. It was about a story he'd been telling himself for years. That my stability was somehow luck or accident, or something that rightfully belonged to the whole family just because I had it and he didn't. He'd been carrying that story so long it started to feel true to him. And when it felt true enough, he said it out loud in front of 20 people and expected me to just accept it. That's the thing about letting something go unaddressed for too long. It doesn't stay the same size. It grows. Every time I sent money without acknowledgement. Every time I let a slight pass because I didn't want conflict. Every time I chose peace over honesty. I wasn't keeping the peace. I was letting the pressure build somewhere out of sight. And eventually it found a table, a holiday, an audience. I don't think I was wrong to help Marcus when he needed it. I'd do it again, honestly. But I should have been clearer about what it was. Help, not obligation. A choice I made, not a pattern he could count on. I let the terms go unstated and he filled in the blanks with something that suited him. What I did right, and I'm not saying this to be proud, just honest, was that I paid attention when something didn't add up. I didn't just react to the pressure. I slowed down and asked the harder question: what is actually going on here? That instinct to look underneath the surface, to follow the numbers instead of the noise. That's not something I was born with. I built it deliberately over years of watching what happens when people don't. My father is a good man who made a bad decision and then couldn't figure out how to undo it without losing face. My mother loves her son in a way that made her willing to sacrifice her daughter's financial security to protect him. Those aren't villainous motivations, they're just human ones, and human ones can do real damage if nobody says anything. Serena speaking up at that table, me speaking up, didn't fix everything. It didn't fix my brother's finances or my parents' debt, or the years of favoritism baked into every family gathering. But it stopped the damage from going one step further. It drew a line that said, "This is where the story changes." I think that's what integrity actually costs sometimes. Not a dramatic gesture, just the willingness to say the true thing at the moment, when it would be much easier to stay quiet and write the check. If you're in something like this, if someone is framing your hard work as a moral debt you owe them, I want you to hear this clearly. Building a stable life is not a betrayal of the people around you. You are not obligated to dismantle what you built because someone else didn't build theirs. You can love your family and still protect what's yours. Those two things are allowed to coexist. The receipts matter. So does knowing when to show them.